The autumn rain fell like tears from heaven over the cobblestone streets of Florence, 1847, in the shadow of the great cathedral, where merchants hawked their finest silks and nobles paraded in gilded carriages. A young woman knelt in the mud with trembling hands extended toward passing strangers. "Per favor, signore, for the children," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the clatter of horse hooves and the distant chiming of church bells. Her dress, once perhaps a respectable shade of blue, now hung in tatters, stained with hunger and desperation. Dark circles shadowed her emerald eyes, and her auburn hair fell in disheveled waves around shoulders that shook not just from the cold, but from the gnawing ache of days without proper food. Isabella Rossini had not always begged in the streets of Florence. Just 3 months ago, she had been a governess in a respectable household, teaching the children of Signora Benedetti their letters and numbers, earning enough to keep herself fed and clothed. But when the scarlet fever swept through the house, taking Signora Benedetti and her husband within days of each other, Isabella had stayed to care for their orphaned children, 7-year-old Marco and 5-year-old little Lucia. With no relatives to claim them and no money left in the household coffers, the children would have been sent to the workhouse. Isabella couldn't bear the thought. She had grown to love them as her own, and she knew what fate awaited orphans in such places. So she had made a choice that would change her life forever. She took the children and fled into the streets, determined to keep them together whatever the cost. Now, as the evening shadows lengthened and her small cloth purse remained painfully light, Isabella felt the familiar weight of despair settling on her chest. She had managed to secure a corner room in the poorest quarter of the city, barely more than a closet with a leaking roof, but even that meager shelter would be lost if she couldn't pay the rent. The children were waiting for her there now, hungry and trusting that somehow their beloved Isabella would find a way to fill their empty bellies. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up hopefully, but instead of dropping coins, the well-dressed merchant simply stepped around her as if she were nothing more than debris in the street. Isabella bit back tears of frustration and humiliation. How had her life come to this? How had love for 2 innocent children led her to such depths of poverty? "Please," she called out to another passerby, a woman in fine velvet. "I have children, they haven't eaten today." But the woman pulled her shawl closer and hurried past, her nose wrinkled in distaste. As the cathedral bells chimed 7 o'clock, Isabella knew she had to return to Marco and Lucia. She had earned only a few small coins, enough perhaps for bread, but not enough for both food and shelter. With a heavy heart, she gathered her shawl around her shoulders and began the long walk back to their tiny room. She didn't notice the figure watching her from the shadows of a nearby palazzo, dark eyes following her progress with an expression of growing concern and curiosity. Lorenzo de' Medici stood motionless in the grand entrance of his family's ancestral palace, his powerful frame outlined against the warm glow of hundreds of candles. As one of the wealthiest men in Italy, heir to a banking empire that stretched across Europe, he was accustomed to luxury that others could barely imagine. Tonight he had been preparing to host yet another elaborate dinner party for Florence's elite, but something had drawn him to the window, and what he saw there had stopped him cold. The young woman begging in the street was not like the usual vagrants who haunted the cathedral square. Despite her obvious poverty, she carried herself with dignity, and there was something in her manner, the way she spoke, the grace with which she moved, that spoke of education, of a gentle upbringing. Most intriguing of all, her pleas had not been for herself, but for children. Lorenzo was a man accustomed to making quick decisions, to reading people and situations with the sharp instincts that had helped him multiply his family's already vast fortune. Something about this woman stirred both his curiosity and his compassion in a way that surprised him. Without quite knowing why, he found himself reaching for his cloak. Excellence, his butler, Giuseppe, appeared at his elbow with the practiced stealth of a man who had served the Medici family for 30 years. "Your guests will be arriving within the hour." "Tell them I've been delayed," Lorenzo said, fastening the clasp of his dark wool cloak. "Something requires my attention." Giuseppe's eyebrows rose slightly. Nothing ever required Lorenzo's attention more than his business obligations, but he simply bowed. "Of course, Excellence. Shall I have your horse prepared?" "No," Lorenzo replied, already moving toward the door. "I go on foot." The rain had intensified by the time Lorenzo reached the narrow street where he had seen the young woman disappear. The wealthy quarter of Florence gave way to increasingly humble neighborhoods, where the grand palazzos were replaced by modest shops and cramped apartments. He followed instinct and the occasional glimpse of her blue dress ahead of him, staying far enough back that she wouldn't notice his presence. When Isabella finally stopped before a crumbling building that looked as if it might collapse at any moment, Lorenzo felt his jaw tighten with anger, not at her, but at the circumstances that had driven a woman of obvious quality to such desperate straits. He watched from the shadows as she climbed an external staircase to a door on the second floor, her movements slow with exhaustion. Through the thin walls and poorly fitted shutters, he could hear voices, a woman's gentle tones mixing with the higher pitches of children. There was laughter, which surprised him. How could there be laughter in such a place, under such circumstances? "Isabella! Isabella!" The sound of running feet echoed in the narrow hallway as Marco and Lucia threw themselves into their guardian's arms the moment she opened the door. "We've been waiting and waiting. Did you bring supper?" Isabella's heart broke a little more at their eager faces, so full of trust and hope. She knelt down to embrace them both, inhaling the sweet scent of their hair and feeling the thinness of their small bodies pressed against her. "I brought bread," she said, forcing brightness into her voice as she showed them the small loaf she had managed to purchase with her meager earnings. "And tomorrow I'll find work. Real work. You'll see." "Will you tell us a story while we eat?" Lucia asked, her dark eyes wide with anticipation. Despite everything they had endured, losing their parents, leaving their comfortable home, living in poverty, the children remained remarkably resilient, largely due to Isabella's determination to shield them from despair. "Of course, little one," Isabella said, ruffling the girl's curls. "What story would you like?" "The one about the princess who lived in a palace made of stars," Marco piped up, climbing onto their single chair. "And she had enough food for everyone in the whole world." Isabella's throat tightened with emotion. Even their favorite stories reflected their current hunger and homelessness. She broke the bread into 3 portions, giving the children slightly larger pieces while trying to make it seem equal. "Once upon a time," she began, settling onto the floor with them gathered around her, "there was a beautiful princess who lived in a palace that reached all the way to the heavens." Outside in the courtyard, Lorenzo found himself drawn closer to the sound of Isabella's voice. He had intended merely to observe, to understand her situation before deciding how best to help. But there was something about the scene that held him transfixed. Through a gap in the shutters, he could see the small family huddled together on the floor of their poor room, sharing their meager meal while Isabella spun tales of magical kingdoms and happy endings. The love between them was palpable, not the love of blood relations, but something even more precious, chosen love, the kind that survives hardship and grows stronger in adversity. Lorenzo, who had grown up surrounded by luxury but often alone, felt something stir in his chest that he didn't immediately recognize. And the princess shared her magical food with everyone in the kingdom. Isabella continued, so that no child ever went to bed hungry again. Do you think there are really princesses like that? Lucia asked softly. I think, Isabella said, pulling both children closer, that magic comes in many forms. Sometimes it's grand and obvious, and sometimes it's as simple as people who care about each other staying together no matter what. Lorenzo found himself smiling in the darkness. The woman might be destitute, but she possessed a wealth of wisdom and love that many of his wealthy acquaintances lacked entirely. His initial impulse to simply send money began to evolve into something more complex. As the children eventually settled into sleep on their shared pallet of straw and old blankets, Isabella sat by the single small window, gazing out at the glittering lights of the wealthy quarter across the river. Somewhere out there, in those grand palaces, people were dining on delicacies while her children slept hungry. The unfairness of it all threatened to overwhelm her. Madonna mia, she whispered to herself, give me strength to keep going, for their sake. Lorenzo, still watching from below, heard the break in her voice and felt something shift inside him. This was no ordinary act of charity he was contemplating. This woman, these children, they had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with the promise of more rain. Isabella woke before the children, as was her habit, and sat for a moment watching them sleep. Marco had his thumb in his mouth, a habit he'd developed since his parents' death, and Lucia clutched a small rag doll that was her most precious possession. They looked so peaceful, so innocent. How could she tell them that they might lose even this poor shelter? A soft knock at the door made her freeze. No one ever visited them here. Landlords didn't knock. They simply broke down doors when rent was overdue. Heart racing, Isabella crept to the entrance. "Che," she called softly, not wanting to wake the children. "Signora, I have a proposition for you," came a deep, cultured voice from the other side of the door. "One that might benefit both of us." Isabella hesitated. The voice was clearly that of an educated man, and there was something compelling about its tone, but she had learned to be cautious. "What kind of proposition?" "The kind best discussed face to face," the voice replied. "I assure you my intentions are honorable. My name is Lorenzo Benedetti." He had decided in an instant to use an assumed name. If she knew his true identity, she might refuse his help out of pride or fear. The name Benedetti made Isabella's heart clench. It was the same as her former employers, the children's parents, though she was certain this couldn't be a relative. They had told her they had no family in Florence. Slowly she opened the door to find herself face to face with the most striking man she had ever seen. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that gleamed even in the grey morning light and eyes the colour of strong coffee, he was dressed in the fine but understated clothing of a successful merchant. There was an air of quiet authority about him, the bearing of a man accustomed to being obeyed, yet his expression was gentle. "Signora," Lorenzo said, removing his hat with a slight bow. "I apologize for the early hour, but I hoped to speak with you before the children woke." "You know about the children?" Isabella asked, immediately defensive. "I know that you care for two orphans, and that you've sacrificed everything to keep them with you," Lorenzo replied. "I also know that you're a woman of education and refinement who deserves better than begging in the streets." Isabella's cheeks flamed with shame and anger. "You've been watching me?" "Yesterday evening, yes," Lorenzo admitted. "I saw you in the cathedral square, and I was moved by your obvious devotion to the children. I followed you here because I wanted to understand your situation before offering help." "I don't need charity," Isabella said proudly, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew how hollow they sounded. "No," Lorenzo agreed, "you need employment, which is what I'm offering." Isabella stared at him, afraid to hope. "What kind of employment?" "I am a widower," Lorenzo said, the lie coming easier than he'd expected. In truth, he had never married too focused on business, and never having met a woman who stirred his interest beyond the superficial. I have need of a housekeeper and caretaker for my home. The position would include lodging for you and the children, meals and a generous salary. Where is your home? Isabella asked suspiciously. In her experience, when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. Not far from here, Lorenzo replied vaguely. A large house that requires proper management. The children would have their own rooms, proper beds, regular meals. They could begin their education again. Isabella felt tears prick her eyes at the picture he painted. It sounded like heaven, but she had learned to be cautious. What would you expect from me in return? And don't pretend it's just housekeeping. No man makes such an offer without expecting additional services. Lorenzo felt a flash of anger at the implication, though he understood why she would be suspicious. I expect nothing more than excellent housekeeping and perhaps the occasional assistance with correspondence. I assume you can read and write. Of course I can read and write, Isabella replied, stung by the suggestion that she might be illiterate. Then we have the basis for an agreement, Lorenzo said. A proper business arrangement, nothing more. You would have your own quarters, complete privacy, and my assurance that you and the children would be treated with absolute respect. Before Isabella could respond, small footsteps pattered across the floor behind her. Isabella, Marco's sleepy voice called. Who are you talking to? Lorenzo knelt down so he was at the boy's eye level. Hello there. You must be Marco. Marco's eyes widened. How do you know my name? Your guardian spoke of you yesterday, Lorenzo said gently. She told me how brave and clever you are. I am brave, Marco agreed solemnly. I take care of Lucia when Isabella has to go out. That's very responsible of you, Lorenzo said seriously. Would you like to see the house where you and Lucia and Isabella might come to live? A real house? Marco's face lit up with excitement. With beds and everything? Isabella put her hand on the boy's shoulder. Marco, go wake Lucia and help her dress. The gentleman and I need to talk. When the child had scampered away, Isabella turned back to Lorenzo. You cannot possibly be serious about this. I am completely serious, Lorenzo replied. In fact, if you're willing to trust me, I'd like to show you the house today. You can see for yourself what I'm offering before making any decision. Isabella studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. She found none, though there was something about his manner that suggested he was not quite what he appeared to be. He carried himself with too much confidence, spoke with too much authority to be merely a successful merchant. If I come to see this house, she said carefully, and if I decide the situation isn't suitable, you'll allow us to leave immediately with no consequences. You have my word as a gentleman, Lorenzo said solemnly. Something in his tone convinced her. Against all her better judgment, Isabella found herself nodding. Very well, but the children and I stay together at all times. I wouldn't have it any other way, Lorenzo assured her. An hour later, Isabella found herself walking through the streets of Florence with Marco and Lucia on either side of her, following the mysterious Signor Benedetti toward an unknown future. The children chattered excitedly about the possibility of real beds and regular meals, while Isabella tried to calm her racing heart. She noticed that their guide seemed to know the city intimately, taking shortcuts through narrow alleys and speaking familiarly to various shopkeepers they passed. When they entered the wealthy quarter near the Arno River, Isabella felt increasingly out of place in her shabby dress and worn shawl. Signor Benedetti, she said finally, I think perhaps this is a mistake. I don't belong in this part of the city. Lorenzo turned to face her, his expression gentle but determined. Isabella, may I call you Isabella? You belong wherever you choose to make your place. Your circumstances do not define your worth. The use of her first name sent an unexpected shiver through her, though she told herself it was merely relief at hearing someone speak to her with respect rather than disdain. They had stopped before the imposing gates of a magnificent palazzo, its Renaissance architecture soaring toward the sky in perfect proportions of marble and stone. Gardens visible through the iron bars spoke of careful cultivation and unlimited resources. "This is it," Lorenzo said simply. Isabella stared at the palace in disbelief. "This is your house? This is where I live." "Yes," Lorenzo replied, which was technically true, though he omitted the fact that he owned not just this palazzo, but several others throughout Italy. "I cannot possibly manage a house like this," Isabella protested. "I was governess to 2 children, not housekeeper to a palace." "The house manages itself, mostly," Lorenzo said with a slight smile. "What I need is someone to oversee the staff, ensure that things run smoothly, and provide a woman's touch to what has become rather a cold, masculine environment. You would have help with all the practical details." As if summoned by his words, the massive gates swung open to reveal Giuseppe, the butler, flanked by several other servants. Isabella noticed that they all seemed genuinely pleased to see their master, which spoke well of his treatment of his employees. "Excellence," Giuseppe began, then caught himself. "Signor Benedetti, welcome home." "Giuseppe, this is Signora Isabella and her charges, Marco and Lucia," Lorenzo said smoothly. "They will be joining our household." "Of course, sir," Giuseppe replied, without missing a beat, though Isabella caught the quick, assessing look he gave her. "Shall I prepare the blue suite?" "Yes, and make sure cook knows we'll need meals suitable for children," Lorenzo instructed. "Also, see that the nursery is cleaned and prepared." As they walked through the palazzo's grand entrance hall, Isabella felt overwhelmed by the opulence surrounding her. Marble floors gleamed beneath soaring frescoed ceilings, and priceless art adorned every wall. The children, less intimidated than their guardian, ran ahead to examine tapestries and sculptures with delighted exclamations. "Isabella, look," Lucia called out, pointing to a fountain in the center of the courtyard. "It has real fish in it." "Be careful not to touch anything," Isabella called after them, acutely aware of their poor clothing against such splendor. "Let them explore," Lorenzo said quietly. "Children should feel free to enjoy beautiful things, not fear them." "Easy to say when they're not your responsibility," Isabella murmured, then immediately regretted the sharp tone. "I apologize. I'm not accustomed to such grandeur." "No apology necessary," Lorenzo replied. "I imagine this is rather overwhelming. Would you like to see your quarters first, or shall I show you the rest of the house?" "Our quarters, please," Isabella said, wanting to establish some sense of normalcy for the children as quickly as possible. The blue suite turned out to be a series of interconnected rooms, more luxurious than anywhere Isabella had ever stayed. The main sitting room was decorated in shades of blue and gold, with comfortable furniture arranged around a fireplace large enough to stand in. Doors led to 2 bedrooms, one clearly intended for her, the other set up as a nursery, with 2 small beds already made up with linens, finer than any the children had ever seen. "This is temporary, of course," Isabella said quickly, not wanting to seem too impressed, "until I can find other arrangements. This is your home for as long as you choose to stay," Lorenzo corrected gently. "There are no time limits on my offer." Marco and Lucia had discovered a chest full of toys in the nursery and were exclaiming over wooden horses and dolls with porcelain faces. Isabella watched them with tears in her eyes. When was the last time they had played with real toys? "Why?" she asked Lorenzo quietly. "Why are you doing this for us? You don't even know us." Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment, watching the children play. "Perhaps because I see something in you that reminds me of what family should be," he said finally. "Love, loyalty, sacrifice for those who matter most. These are qualities I value highly." "You said you were a widower," Isabella said carefully. "Did you have children?" The lie he had told earlier seemed to stick in Lorenzo's throat. "No," he said quietly. "No children." Something in his tone warned Isabella not to pursue the topic, though she filed the information away. There were depths to this man that she didn't understand yet. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Giuseppe entered with a tea service laden with delicate sandwiches, pastries and fresh fruit. "Cook thought the children might be hungry," he said with a smile, setting the tray on a low table. Marco and Lucia abandoned their toys immediately, their eyes wide at the feast before them. Isabella started to tell them to eat slowly, not to appear greedy, but Lorenzo caught her hand gently. "Let them enjoy it," he said softly. "They're children, and they're hungry. There's no shame in that." As Isabella watched her beloved charges devour the first full meal they'd had in days, she felt something crack inside her chest. This man, this stranger who called himself Benedetti, was showing her children more kindness than their own blood relatives had bothered to offer. "How do you know about children's needs?" she asked him quietly. "If you never had any of your own." Lorenzo smiled mysteriously. "A man learns many things in business, including how to read people's needs. Besides, I was a child once myself." "Yes, but clearly not a hungry one," Isabella observed, taking in his well-fed frame and expensive clothing. "No," Lorenzo agreed. "I was fortunate in my circumstances, which is perhaps why I feel obligated to share that fortune when I encounter others less fortunate." There was something in his tone that made Isabella study his face more carefully. She was beginning to suspect that Signor Benedetti was more than he appeared to be, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what he was hiding. That evening, after the children had been bathed by chambermaids and tucked into their new beds with full bellies and clean nightgowns, Isabella found herself alone with Lorenzo in the Palazzo's library. She had been exploring the house while he attended to business, and the sheer scale of the place had left her reeling. Room after room of priceless art, furniture that belonged in museums, servants who clearly worshipped their master. This was no merchant's house. "Signor Benedetti," she said carefully, settling into a chair across from where he sat reading correspondence by the fire. "I must ask you something directly, and I hope you'll give me an honest answer." Lorenzo looked up from his papers, his dark eyes unreadable. "Of course. Who are you really?" Isabella asked. "And please don't insult my intelligence by pretending you're simply a successful merchant. No merchant lives like this. No merchant commands the obvious devotion of an army of servants. No merchant has a palazzo that could house half of Florence." Lorenzo set down his papers and studied her face for a long moment. The firelight played across her features, highlighting the intelligence in her green eyes and the determined set of her jaw. She had cleaned up beautifully. One of the maids had provided her with a proper dress in deep green that complemented her coloring perfectly, and her auburn hair had been arranged in a becoming style. But it was more than her physical transformation that struck him. There was a strength about her, a quiet dignity that no amount of poverty could diminish. "You're very perceptive," he said finally. "I'm not blind," Isabella replied. "I've lived in wealthy households, remember? I know the difference between comfortable success and this." She gestured around the magnificently appointed library. "This is old money. Generations of it. This is power." Lorenzo rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out over the gardens where torches lit the pathways between perfectly manicured hedges. "If I tell you the truth," he said quietly, Will you promise to hear me out before making any judgments? Isabella felt her heart begin to race. Whatever he was about to reveal, she sensed it would change everything between them. I promise. Lorenzo turned back to face her, his expression serious. My name is not Benedetti. It is Lorenzo di Medici. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. Di Medici, one of the most powerful families in Italy, with banking interests that stretched across Europe and political influence that reached the highest levels of government. She was sitting in the home of one of the wealthiest men in the world. Madonna mia, she whispered, pressing her hand to her chest. I'm the man who found you begging in the street and couldn't stop thinking about your situation. Lorenzo said firmly. Everything else is just details. Isabella stood abruptly, pacing to the fireplace as her mind raced. Details? You're one of the most powerful men in Italy. What could you possibly want with a penniless governess and 2 orphaned children? I want exactly what I told you, Lorenzo replied. Someone to manage my household and give warmth to a place that has become too cold and empty. You could have any woman in Italy, Isabella protested. Noble ladies who would be perfect hostesses, who know how to navigate your world. I don't want any woman in Italy, Lorenzo said quietly. I want you. The words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning that went far beyond a simple employment offer. Isabella turned to stare at him, her heart pounding. You don't even know me, she whispered. I know that you chose to sacrifice everything rather than abandon 2 children who weren't even your own. Lorenzo replied, moving closer to her. I know that you maintained your dignity even in the depths of poverty. I know that you can make a palace feel like a home with nothing more than your presence. What else do I need to know? Isabella shook her head, overwhelmed. This is impossible. We're from different worlds. I'm nobody. A servant, essentially. You're the woman who has haunted my thoughts for days, Lorenzo said, close enough now that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. You're the woman who made me question everything I thought I knew about what matters in life. Before Isabella could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of running feet and muffled sobbing. Lucia appeared in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. Isabella, the little girl cried, throwing herself into her guardian's arms. I had a bad dream. I thought you had gone away and left us. Isabella knelt to embrace the child, her heart breaking at the terror in Lucia's voice. Shh, bambina, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Promise? Lucia hiccuped against Isabella's shoulder. I promise, Isabella said firmly, though her eyes met Lorenzo's over the child's head with a look that contained 1,000 questions. Lorenzo knelt beside them, his expression gentle. Lucia, would it help if I showed you something special? The little girl peered at him with tear-filled eyes. What kind of special? Come with me, Lorenzo said, offering his hand. Both of you. He led them through the palazzo's winding corridors to a room Isabella hadn't seen before. When he opened the heavy wooden doors, she gasped in wonder. The ceiling was painted with a breathtaking fresco of the night sky, complete with constellations that seemed to twinkle in the lamplight. The walls were lined with books, but these were children's stories, beautifully illustrated volumes that spoke of careful selection and great expense. This is the star room, Lorenzo said softly. When I was a boy and had nightmares, my nonna would bring me here and tell me that the stars would watch over me while I slept. Lucia's eyes went wide with wonder. Real stars? The most faithful guardians in the world. Lorenzo assured her. They never sleep, never look away, never leave their posts. As long as you can see the stars, you're never truly alone. Can Marco see them too? Lucia asked. Of course, Lorenzo said. In fact, I think this room would make an excellent playroom for both of you during the day, and perhaps bedrooms for when you're older and want to sleep under the stars." Isabella felt tears prick her eyes again. This man, this incredibly powerful, wealthy man, was going to extraordinary lengths to comfort a frightened child who was nothing to him. "Thank you," she whispered, as Lucia settled into a comfortable chair with a picture book, her fears apparently forgotten. "It's I who should thank you," Lorenzo replied quietly. "You've brought life back into this house. I hadn't realized how much I missed the sound of children's laughter." As they stood watching Lucia turn the pages of her book, Isabella felt something shift inside her chest. The walls she had built around her heart, walls constructed of caution, pride and fear, began to crack. This man had seen her at her lowest point and offered not just charity but genuine care. He had taken in her children and was treating them like precious treasures rather than burdens. And the way he looked at her, "Lorenzo," she said softly, using his real name for the first time. He turned to her, and she saw her own emotions reflected in his dark eyes, hope, desire, and the terrifying possibility of love. "This changes everything," she whispered. "Yes," he agreed, "it does." The following weeks passed like a dream. Isabella settled into her role as the palazzo's unofficial mistress with surprising ease, her natural grace and intelligence making her a perfect hostess for Lorenzo's business associates and social obligations. The children blossomed under the attention of the household staff, who had quickly grown to adore them. Marco, in particular, had attached himself to Giuseppe, who was teaching him the finer points of palazzo management and Italian history. Lucia had discovered the kitchen, where the cook, a motherly woman named Francesca, delighted in teaching her simple recipes and letting her help with the baking. But it was the evenings that Isabella treasured most. Those quiet hours after the children were asleep, when she and Lorenzo would sit in the library or walk through the gardens, talking about everything and nothing. She learned that beneath his powerful exterior, Lorenzo was a man hungry for genuine connection, someone who had achieved everything the world said should matter, but had found it empty without someone to share it with. "Tell me about your family," Isabella said one evening as they strolled beneath the stars in the palazzo's rose garden. She had been living in his house for nearly a month, but Lorenzo rarely spoke of his personal history. "There isn't much to tell," Lorenzo replied, his voice carefully neutral. "My father built the family fortune, my mother died when I was young, and I've focused on expanding our interests ever since." "That's business history," Isabella said gently. "I asked about family." Lorenzo was quiet for so long that Isabella thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. "I learnt early that wealth attracts many things, but rarely genuine affection," he said. "People want to know Lorenzo de' Medici for what he can do for them, not for who he is underneath all the trappings of power." "Is that why you lied about your name when we first met?" Isabella asked. "I wanted to see if you could care for the man, not the fortune." Lorenzo admitted. "I'd never met anyone who looked at me and saw just me." Isabella stopped walking and turned to face him fully. In the moonlight, he looked younger, more vulnerable than the commanding figure he presented to the world. "What do you see when you look at me?" she asked softly. Lorenzo reached out to cup her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "I see home," he said simply. "I see the woman who made me understand what I've been missing all these years." When he kissed her, it was with all the pent-up longing of weeks of growing attraction and deepening affection. Isabella melted into his embrace, feeling as if she were finally exactly where she belonged. But their happiness was threatened by forces beyond their control. Word of Lorenzo's mysterious houseguest had begun to spread through Florence's social circles, and not all of the attention was welcome. "Excellence," Giuseppe said one morning, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. "The Contessa di Montesoro is requesting an audience with you. She seems quite insistent." Lorenzo looked up from his correspondence with a frown. Contessa di Montesoro was one of Florence's most influential society matrons, a woman whose approval could make or break social standing in the city. She was also the mother of Caterina, a young woman who had been widely assumed to be Lorenzo's eventual bride. "What does she want?" Lorenzo asked, though he suspected he already knew. "She didn't say, Excellence, but she did mention that she had heard rumors about your household arrangements." Isabella, who had been reviewing menu plans with Francesca, felt her stomach clench with dread. She had known this moment would come eventually, the moment when Lorenzo's world would demand an accounting of his choices. "Show her to the main salon," Lorenzo said reluctantly, "and ask Signora Isabella to join us there." "Lorenzo, no," Isabella protested immediately. "I don't belong in that conversation." "You belong wherever I say you belong," Lorenzo replied firmly. "We face this together." The Contessa di Montesoro was exactly what Isabella had expected, a woman of middle age whose beauty had hardened into sharp elegance, dressed in the finest silks and dripping with jewels that probably cost more than most people saw in a lifetime. Her dark eyes took in Isabella's appearance with obvious disdain. "Excellence," she said to Lorenzo with a curtsy that managed to be both respectful and subtly mocking. "How good of you to see me, and this must be your housekeeper." "This is Signora Isabella Rossini," Lorenzo replied evenly. "She manages my household affairs." "How modern of you," the Contessa said, her tone making it clear what she thought of such modernity. "I'm sure she's very capable." Isabella felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. She was being dismissed, judged, found wanting by a woman who knew nothing about her except her current social status. "What can I do for you, Contessa?" Lorenzo asked, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I come as a friend." "Excellence, to warn you that people are talking. The arrangement you have here, it's causing quite a stir among those who matter." "And what exactly are people saying?" Lorenzo's voice had taken on a dangerous edge that Isabella had never heard before. "That you're keeping a woman of questionable background under your roof. That you've been seen in public with her and 2 children of unknown parentage. That you're risking your reputation and your family's good name for a woman who was literally begging in the streets." The Contessa's words hit Isabella like physical blows. Every fear she had harbored about their impossible situation came flooding back. She was exactly what the woman described, a beggar who had been lifted far above her proper station by Lorenzo's misguided kindness. "I see," Lorenzo said quietly, "and I suppose these concerned friends have suggestions for how I should remedy this situation." "Return her to her proper place," the Contessa said bluntly. "My daughter Caterina is still available, still willing to make an advantageous match. You could have your pick of any noble family in Italy. Why saddle yourself with damaged goods?" That was too much for Isabella. She rose from her chair, her dignity gathering around her like armor. "You're quite right, Contessa," she said calmly. "I am far beneath Lorenzo's station, and I have no business in his world. If you'll excuse me, I have packing to do." "Isabella, no," Lorenzo said sharply, but she was already moving toward the door. "The children and I will be gone by evening," Isabella said without turning around. "Please give our thanks to the staff for their kindness." She left the room before either Lorenzo or the Contessa could respond, her heart breaking with each step that took her further from the man she had foolishly allowed herself to love. Isabella was in her bedroom, mechanically folding the few possessions she had brought to the palazzo, when Lorenzo burst through the door without knocking. "What are you doing?" he demanded. What I should have done weeks ago, Isabella replied without looking up from her packing. Returning to my proper place, as the Contessa so eloquently put it. The Contessa is a bitter woman who sees threats where none exist, Lorenzo said firmly, moving to take the clothes from her hands. Her opinion means nothing to me, but the opinions of others like her do, Isabella replied gently but firmly, taking her belongings back. I've seen how your world works, Lorenzo. I know what I am to them, and what I always will be. What you are, Lorenzo said, grasping her shoulders, is the woman I love, the woman I want to marry. Isabella went very still. Marry? Yes, marry, Lorenzo repeated. I should have asked you properly weeks ago. Isabella, will you be my wife? Tears streamed down Isabella's face as she looked into his beloved eyes. Oh, Lorenzo, you know I can't. Why not? He demanded. Because some narrow-minded aristocrats disapprove, because I'm wealthy and you're not. None of that matters to me. It matters to your world, Isabella said sadly. It matters to your business associates, your political connections, your social standing. I won't be the woman who destroys everything you've built. And I won't be the man who lets the woman he loves walk away because other people are too small-minded to see her worth, Lorenzo replied fiercely. The children need stability, Isabella continued, as if he hadn't spoken. They need to grow up somewhere they belong, not constantly wondering if they're good enough for the world around them. They belong with us, Lorenzo insisted. We're their family now. We're a fantasy, Isabella whispered. A beautiful dream that was always going to end. Before Lorenzo could argue further, there was a commotion in the courtyard below. Through the window they could see a crowd gathering, and the sound of angry voices drifted up to them. Giuseppe appeared in the doorway, his face pale with worry. Excellence, forgive the intrusion, but there's a mob gathering outside. They're calling for the foreign woman to be expelled from the palazzo. Isabella closed her eyes in despair. It was even worse than she had feared. You see, she said to Lorenzo, this is what I bring to your life. Scandal, division, chaos. Lorenzo's face went dark with fury. Giuseppe, send word to the authorities. I want that mob dispersed immediately. Excellence, Giuseppe said carefully. Perhaps it would be better to simply address their concerns directly. The implication was clear. Give them what they wanted. Send Isabella away. I will not be bullied by ignorant fools, Lorenzo said flatly. This is my home, and I will decide who lives here. But even as he spoke, they could hear the crowd growing larger and more agitated. Isabella realized with growing horror that the situation was spiraling beyond control. Her presence was literally creating civil unrest. Lorenzo, she said quietly, please, let me go. For your sake, for the children's sake, for everyone's sake. Never, Lorenzo replied, but she could see the strain in his eyes as he listened to the angry voices below. Isabella made her decision then, the hardest decision of her life. While Lorenzo was distracted by the commotion outside, she slipped from the room and made her way to the nursery, where Marco and Lucia were playing with their toys, blissfully unaware of the chaos surrounding them. Come, little ones, she said as normally as she could manage. We're going on an adventure. What kind of adventure? Marco asked excitedly. The kind where we see new places and meet new people, Isabella replied, her heart breaking as she helped them gather their few belongings. Is Lorenzo coming too? Lucia asked. Isabella knelt down to the little girl's level, memorizing every detail of her sweet face. Lorenzo has to stay here, she said softly. But he'll always love you, and you must always remember him. I don't want to go without Lorenzo, Lucia protested, her eyes filling with tears. Sometimes, Isabella said, fighting back her own tears, We have to be very brave and do things we don't want to do, because it's what's best for everyone we love. Using a servant's staircase, Isabella managed to spirit the children out of the palazzo without being seen by either Lorenzo or the angry crowd still gathered at the main entrance. Her heart shattered with every step that took them further from the only real happiness she had ever known, but she forced herself to keep walking. They were halfway across the city before Lorenzo discovered they were gone. His roar of rage and despair echoed through the palazzo, sending servants scurrying for cover. He immediately organized search parties, offering vast rewards for any information about Isabella's whereabouts, but she had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. For 3 days, Lorenzo searched every corner of Florence and beyond, growing more desperate with each passing hour. The irony was not lost on him. He had found her when she was a beggar with nowhere to hide, but now that she was determined to disappear, she had somehow managed to vanish completely. It was Giuseppe who finally brought him the information he needed. "Excellence," the butler said carefully, "I believe I know where they might be." Lorenzo looked up from the maps he had been studying, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and grief. "Where?" "The convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie, about 20 miles north of the city. The Mother Superior there is known for taking in women and children with nowhere else to go." Lorenzo was already reaching for his cloak. "Have my horse saddled." "Excellence," Giuseppe said hesitantly, "perhaps you should consider what you'll say to her. She left for a reason, several reasons in fact. Simply demanding that she return may not be sufficient." Lorenzo paused, his hand on the door handle. Giuseppe was right, of course. Isabella had made an impossible choice for what she believed were the right reasons. If he wanted to convince her to come back, he would need more than just his own desperate need to have her in his life. The convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie sat nestled in a valley surrounded by olive groves, its ancient stone walls radiating peace and sanctuary. When Lorenzo was shown into the simple parlor where visitors were received, he felt as if he were entering a different world entirely. Isabella appeared a few minutes later, dressed in the plain brown dress of a lay sister, her beautiful hair covered by a simple veil. She looked thinner than when he had last seen her just 3 days earlier, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Lorenzo," she said quietly, not moving from the doorway, "you shouldn't have come." "Where else would I go?" he replied, drinking in the sight of her like a man dying of thirst. "You are my heart, Isabella. Without you, I'm nothing more than a rich man rattling around in an empty house." "You're the most powerful man in Italy," Isabella said. "You have responsibilities, obligations, none of which mean anything without you," Lorenzo interrupted. "These past 3 days have been the longest of my life. The palazzo feels like a tomb. Even the servants are walking around like mourners at a funeral." Isabella's resolve wavered slightly at the pain in his voice, but she forced herself to remain strong. "The children are settling in well here. The sisters are kind, and they'll receive a good education. They belong with us," Lorenzo said. "You all belong with me. I don't belong in your world," Isabella repeated, though the words seemed to cost her greatly. "Then I'll leave it," Lorenzo said simply. Isabella stared at him in shock. "What?" "I said I'll leave it," Lorenzo repeated. "If my world can't accept the woman I love, then I'll find a new world where it can." "Lorenzo, you can't be serious. Your family's legacy, your business empire, can all be managed by competent people who don't need me looking over their shoulders every day," Lorenzo finished. "I've been thinking about this constantly since you left. I've spent so many years building wealth and power, but what's the point of any of it if I have no one to share it with?" "You're talking about giving up everything," Isabella whispered. "I'm talking about gaining everything that matters," Lorenzo corrected. You, the children, a chance at real happiness instead of empty success. Isabella sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was suggesting. Where would we go? How would we live? Anywhere you want, Lorenzo said, moving closer but not touching her, sensing that she needed space to think. I have investments throughout Europe, properties in places where no one would know or care about Italian social conventions. We could buy a villa in the countryside or a house by the sea. I could teach Marco about business while you school Lucia in all the things young ladies should know. We could be a real family. But your responsibilities, I have cousins who can manage the Italian operations, Lorenzo said. Good men who've been chomping at the bit for more authority anyway. The Medici name will survive without me being chained to Florence for the rest of my life. Isabella looked at him through tears that she could no longer hold back. You would really do that? Give up everything you've built? Isabella, Lorenzo said softly, finally crossing the room to kneel before her chair. I spent 35 years building a fortune and accumulating power, and I was miserable. I've spent 6 weeks loving you and being loved in return, and I've been happier than I ever thought possible. Which life do you think I value more? Before Isabella could answer, the sound of running feet echoed in the corridor outside, and Marco burst into the room. Lorenzo, the boy cried, throwing himself into the man's arms. You found us. I knew you would. Lucia appeared a moment later, moving more shyly but with obvious joy shining in her dark eyes. Are you here to take us home? She asked hopefully. Lorenzo looked at Isabella over the children's heads, his eyes full of love and hope and the promise of a different future. That depends, he said softly. Isabella, will you marry me? Will you let me give you and the children my name, my protection, and my love? Will you be my family? Isabella looked at the man who had literally saved her from the streets, who had treated her with respect and kindness when the world saw only a beggar, who was now willing to give up everything for her. She looked at the children who had already lost so much, but who still believed in happy endings. Yes, she whispered, and then louder, yes, Lorenzo, I'll marry you. The wedding took place a month later in a small chapel in the hills outside Florence, far from the prying eyes of society and the judgment of those who believed love should follow the rules of class and convention. Isabella wore a simple dress of ivory silk, and Lorenzo had never seen anyone more beautiful. The guest list was small but meaningful. The household staff who had come to love Isabella and the children, Giuseppe, who had served as Lorenzo's witness and friend, and the nuns from the convent who had become like family to them all during their brief stay. As they exchanged vows in the ancient chapel, with sunlight streaming through stained glass windows and the children beaming from the front pew, Isabella felt a peace settle over her that she had never experienced before. This was right. This was love as it was meant to be. Not based on social advantage or family connections, but on genuine affection, respect, and shared dreams. Do you, Lorenzo de' Medici, take Isabella Rossini to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? I do, Lorenzo said, his voice strong and sure, his eyes never leaving Isabella's face. Do you, Isabella Rossini, take Lorenzo de' Medici to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? I do, Isabella replied, her voice filled with joy and certainty. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Lorenzo's kiss was tender and full of promise for their future together. True to his word, Lorenzo arranged for the management of his Italian holdings to be transferred to his cousins, retaining only enough involvement to ensure the family legacy continued. He purchased a beautiful villa in the hills of Tuscany, far enough from Florence to avoid unwanted attention, but close enough for occasional business when necessary. The Villa Bella Vista, as it came to be known, became a haven of happiness and love. Isabella threw herself into creating a true home for their family, while Lorenzo discovered the joys of a life lived for personal fulfillment rather than just financial gain. Marco thrived under Lorenzo's tutelage, showing a natural aptitude for numbers and business that promised well for his future. Lucia blossomed into a confident young lady under Isabella's gentle guidance, her artistic talents encouraged and nurtured. But perhaps the greatest joy came 2 years after their marriage, when Isabella gave birth to their first child together. A son they named Alessandro, after Lorenzo's grandfather. The baby's arrival completed their family in a way that felt both destined and miraculous. "Look at him," Isabella murmured one evening as she nursed their son while Lorenzo read to Marco and Lucia by the fire. "He has your eyes and your stubborn chin," Lorenzo replied with a grin, looking up from the storybook. "He's going to be trouble, that one." "The best kind of trouble," Isabella said contentedly. As the years passed, their love story became legend in the region. Travelers would hear tales of the wealthy lord who had given up his palace for love of a woman he found begging in the streets, and many came to see for themselves the family that had chosen love over convention. Isabella established a small school for local children, using her skills as a former governess to ensure that education was available to all, regardless of their family's circumstances. Lorenzo invested in local farms and businesses, bringing prosperity to the entire valley. Their example inspired others as well. Several young couples in the region made matches based on love rather than advantage, citing the happiness of the Medici family as proof that such choices could lead to lasting joy. But perhaps their greatest legacy was the love they had shown to Marco and Lucia, who grew up to be remarkable adults. Marco eventually returned to Florence as a young man, where he used his education and Lorenzo's connections to establish himself as a successful merchant. He married for love, following the example set by his adoptive parents, and named his first daughter Isabella in honor of the woman who had saved him. Lucia became an artist of considerable talent, her paintings celebrated throughout Italy. She too married for love, choosing a kind-hearted physician who shared her passion for helping others. Their home became a gathering place for artists and intellectuals, continuing the tradition of warmth and hospitality that Isabella had established. On their golden wedding anniversary, Lorenzo and Isabella sat on the terrace of their villa, watching their grandchildren play in the garden below. The boy who had once begged in the streets to feed Marco and Lucia was now a cherished nonna, while the richest lord in Italy had found his greatest treasure in a simple life filled with love. "Do you ever regret it?" Isabella asked, echoing the question Lorenzo had once posed to her. "Giving up the palazzo, the power, the position in society?" Lorenzo took her weathered hand in his and raised it to his lips. "I gave up nothing," he said softly. "I traded an empty title for a full heart. I exchanged a cold palace for a warm home. I replaced the admiration of strangers with the love of family." Even when people still whisper about the great Lorenzo de' Medici, who threw away his inheritance for a beggar woman, Isabella teased. "Especially then," Lorenzo replied, "because they'll never understand what I really found that night in the cathedral square. I didn't rescue a beggar woman, I discovered the other half of my soul." Isabella leaned against his shoulder, contentment filling every fiber of her being. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as the greatest losses. I lost my position, my security, my pride, and found my purpose, my home, my heart. And I lost my bachelor freedom and found my reason for living," Lorenzo added with a smile. As the sun set over the Tuscan hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Isabella and Lorenzo reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a desperate night in the streets of Florence to a lifetime of shared love and purpose, their story had become one for the ages. Their love had indeed conquered all, not through grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but through the quiet, daily choice to put each other and their family first. They had faced the disapproval of society, the challenge of blending their different worlds, and the ordinary struggles that test every marriage, and they had emerged stronger each time. In the nearby village, their story was still told to young couples contemplating marriage, the tale of the Lord who loved a beggar and found riches beyond measure. But to Isabella and Lorenzo themselves, the greatest testament to their love was not the romantic legend they had become, but the family they had built, the community they had served, and the example they had set that love, when it is true and selfless, really can overcome any obstacle. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Lorenzo helped Isabella to her feet, and they walked hand in hand into their home, the home they had built together with love, patience, and unwavering commitment to each other and to the children who had brought them together. "Forever and always?" Lorenzo asked, using the words that had become their private promise to each other. "Forever and always," Isabella replied, and sealed the promise with a kiss that still held all the passion and tenderness of their first embrace in the Palazzo Gardens so many years before. Their love story was complete, but their legacy would live on in the hearts of all who heard it. A testament to the truth that love, real love, knows no boundaries of class or circumstance, and that sometimes the greatest fortunes are found not in gold or power, but in the willingness to open one's heart to another soul in need. The woman who had once begged in the streets to feed his children had indeed become the richest lady in Italy, rich in love, rich in purpose, rich in the knowledge that she had lived a life that mattered. And the Lord who had given up his palace for love had found his true kingdom in the arms of the woman who had taught him that the greatest wealth of all is a heart filled with love.